Welcome to Reflections with Amanda DeRocher, a New View Advice mini-sode series. Welcome to Reflections. I'm Amanda DeRocher, and this is a New View Advice mini-sode series where I share stories and writings from my own healing journey. This week, I'll be sharing a story about an experience I had in high school around stalking. This is an experience I felt so much shame over. I honestly couldn't look at this for a very long time. I couldn't admit this happened to myself for a very long time. I couldn't forgive myself for a very long time. I blamed myself for this situation and for the pain it put me through. I felt insane. I felt like I had gone insane and I lived in a state of denial. I share that up front because as I tell the story, you'll hear it in a coherent way, but it didn't always feel like a coherent narrative to me. And that's what trauma does to someone, is that as we peel back the layers, we are beginning to see our truth more clearly, but it takes time and it takes patience. So if anybody out there can relate to any part of this story, I'm sending you so much love, because all parts of this story are pretty heartbreaking in my opinion, because trauma is painful. Trauma is one of those hidden wounds. It's very often unseen. And this experience I went through was an invisible battle I was fighting. And I just wanted to share that up front because honestly, for a long time, the shame caused me to keep this story a secret, and that felt like a burden. So with that, let's jump on into this week's story. That time I stalked my stalker. I froze as I felt a hand brush my back. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. It was one of the guys who raped me months earlier. I was 15 years old, and I had unknowingly entered a game of cat and mouse that I had no control over. I should start this story by setting the scene. When I was a freshman in high school, I was gang raped by a group of upperclassmen. They were 1 and 2 years older than me, an age gap that feels insignificant now, but felt so huge when I was an innocent teenage girl. Before this instance, I viewed the world as a safe place where everyone wanted me to be happy. This was a lie that I wish someone had taught me long before I was forced to learn it for myself. In the aftermath, I tried to piece together what happened to me. I was confused, I was overwhelmed, I was traumatized. I dissociated during the experience and only remembered bits and pieces of the attack, not a whole narrative to tell. I was experiencing common trauma symptoms, but I wouldn't have words to express my experience for another decade. Instead, I barely believed myself, so when anyone showed doubt, I caved in and became quiet and filled with shame and self-blame. My mind no longer worked the way it once had. Nothing made sense. In the days after him and his friends violated me, they pretended I didn't exist. I was suddenly a ghost. On Friday, I was a happy-go-lucky girl who thought she had friends, and on Monday, I was a social pariah who now lived with the label slut. I was confused. I still believed he was a good guy. Everyone liked him. I was the only one who was afraid of him. How could I be right if my whole world was telling me I was wrong? On the fateful night when I first met him, I felt chosen. I felt so cool. He was giving me so much attention. As a young teenager, high school was my world, and him and his friends ruled the kingdom. I was a pauper who thought she had the chance to become a princess. I was completely naive that his intentions were far from innocent, and instead would leave me close to dead. He did not choose me that night because he liked me. He chose me because he saw easy prey. He knew the end of the game before I even knew the rules. One day, after trying to tell the wrong person that I thought something bad happened to me, I was approached by a friend. She told me that one of the boys who raped me wanted her to tell me that I needed to stop speaking about what happened. If I continued talking, he'd kill me. She smiled and walked away like she hadn't just shattered my whole world. I froze. I got tunnel vision. I couldn't breathe. I managed to make my way to a bathroom where I threw up. This was my first panic attack. I wouldn't understand this was a panic attack for many years, though. I eventually made my way to class, where I was scolded for being late. I began crying in the middle of class. I was yelled at and sent to the vice principal's office, where I couldn't speak through the tears. I was then passed to a guidance counselor who told me she didn't have time for me when I walked in with tears streaming down my face. I returned to the floor of a bathroom and wept until I could get myself together. I didn't speak of this instance again for over a decade. So I was surprised when, after he threatened to kill me, he began stalking me. I thought I was overreacting and making it up. Why would the guy who called me a crazy lying slut stalk me? Did he hate me or did he like me? I began changing my route to class, but he was somehow always there. No matter which way I turned, there he was. He never said anything. He wouldn't even look at me. I would mention the coincidences to people, and they'd tell me I was overreacting. He became like a shadow that lived with me long beyond the days where he actually lingered in the stairwells of my high school, waiting for me. I was going insane. I didn't have anyone to talk to about this. Nowhere I turned was safe. There'd be weeks I wouldn't see him, so I would think I was free and had made the whole thing up. And then suddenly there he would be again, passing me every day. Over time, his stalking escalated. He began to appear when I was alone in a stairwell or I would be in an empty hallway. These were the only moments he acknowledged me. When we were alone, he would stare right at me. He would smile. He would brush his hand along my back. He would give me just enough to know that I hadn't made the whole thing up. He'd send me into a trauma response with a glance, but at the time, I didn't know that's what was happening. Was he intentionally trying to drive me insane? Did he like torturing me? Or was it simpler than that? Maybe he found it fun and then he would get bored of this game we played, and then start it up again when he felt like it. Or maybe he knew a truth that I didn't at the time, that I held more power than I realized by knowing the truth of what he'd done. Eventually, he became all I thought about. When I realized I couldn't escape him, I thought I could play it cool. I pretended I didn't notice him. I pretended I wasn't terrified. When he was around, I would laugh louder, smile bigger, be brighter. If I couldn't escape him, I'd at least make him believe it didn't bother me. But I was like a hamster on a wheel. I thought I was moving forward when I was really just trapped in a cage, running in circles. The stalking was mostly just his presence, with the occasional light touch, until one night when we were at the same concert. I didn't know he'd be there. As I exited the concert, I got separated from my friends. I knew where the car was, so I wasn't worried. I was in a large crowd moving towards the exit when two hands grabbed my waist. I knew who it was before he said, "Shh," in my ear. He leaned in close, smelled my hair, and rubbed himself on me. His hands slid down the sides of my skirt. They lingered just beneath the hem. I froze. I had no voice. I had no thoughts. As quickly as he was there, he was gone, lost in the sea of people surrounding me. I exited the crowd and ran to the car. When I got to the car, I couldn't stop crying. What had just happened? Had I made the whole thing up? Was I the problem? This is the moment a switch flipped inside me, and I decided I was going to win this game. I had been caught off guard one too many times, so I decided to start stalking my stalker. I didn't label it as stalking at the time, but I thought if I knew where he was before he knew where I was, then I would never be caught off guard, and he wouldn't be able to hurt me again. I knew what staircase he took at what time. I knew what his class schedule was. I knew his lunch period. I knew where he worked. If I knew where he was at all times, I'd be safe, right? Wrong. He was a predator and I was his prey, and he was always a few steps ahead of me. He was good at this game. I was not. I was too obvious. I was not clever. I would talk about him, trying to casually figure out his whereabouts. I did not know that I was supposed to hide this game we played. I didn't know that his royal subjects were reporting back my every word. It was easy for him to flip the narrative when he learned what I was doing. I had already been labeled a liar by him and his friends. So when he caught on to my little game, he began telling people that I was stalking him. Suddenly I was being approached by people saying they heard I was stalking him. Was this true? I tried to deny it, but the truth was I had memorized his whereabouts. I had become completely obsessed with him. Had I become a stalker? I stopped talking about him, but I continued to keep tabs on him. Every time I entered a room, a party, the local grocery store, it was his face I searched for. There would be months where he backed off, and I'd think it was finally over, but then it would all begin again. Sometimes I felt like it was my fault that the cycle would begin again. I would know he'd be at a party, and I'd still go. It felt unfair that he was able to walk around unaffected by what happened, and I felt broken and worthless. How could everyone pretend that that night in the woods meant nothing when it had changed me on every level? I had not yet accepted the truth that sometimes the world is unfair and unsafe. So instead, I chose to make it appear that I was okay. So on those occasions that I willingly walked into the lion's den, knowing we would be at the same place and thinking I was smart enough to outwit him, he'd always show me that I was the pawn and he had the power to checkmate me. This happened at more parties than I'd like to admit. I'd pretend I was having fun while trying to keep an eye on him, but as the drinks flowed, I'd lose track of him. This is when he'd find me. In a moment, I was alone. I would go from having my guard up to being completely caught off guard. He'd smile at me, knowing that I was once again a fly caught in his web, and he held all the power. He'd approach me, my breath would catch. Was I about to be redeemed through him asking for forgiveness, or was he about to ruin me in a way I'd never come back from? Instead, he'd say my name like we were old friends who knew each other's deepest, darkest secrets. Maybe offer me a compliment. And then he'd walk away the moment someone else approached. He never wanted anyone to know about this game we played. There were times that my 15-year-old self mistook this obsession for romance. I had no experience with boys. I would read romance novels like Twilight, where the lead guy would exhibit possessive and controlling behavior. He would follow the young girl out of town. He knew her whereabouts even when she didn't tell him. It wasn't called stalking in those books. It was called love. So what if this experience was just this guy's attempt to get my attention? But that was the denial talking, not allowing me to see how bad the situation really was. Because when I'd see him in the hall and feel terror in my gut, Deep down inside, I knew I was playing a dangerous game, a truth I couldn't admit to myself until he went to college and there were multiple state lines between us. This game continued for the 2 years we overlapped in high school. My memories of those 2 years were filled with fear, terror, and shame. While my classmates were discovering themselves and trying new things for the first time, I was stuck in a trauma loop it would take over 15 years to unravel. When he went to college, I realized how fucked up this game we played was. In reflection, I now see that the mind will make up all kinds of stories in the name of self-preservation. It would take another decade for me to learn about how trauma impacts us on every level, and how this was the only way I knew how to protect myself at the time. No one prepares you for the aftermath of trauma, and how the world will expect a child to act logically when you have just lost your mind because you experience things that most people only see depicted in horror movies. We ran into each other a few more times before I left my hometown. But in those moments, I had learned to run when I saw him. I no longer played his game. Instead, I ran as far and as fast as I could. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Reflections. I'm a little lost for words because part of me wants to say, I hope you enjoyed this story, but I'm not sure if it's a story to be enjoyed or just a story to be heard and to be shared and to be witnessed. I know I'm not the only one, so I wanted to share it here because, as I said at the beginning, it took me a very long time to make peace with this story and to get to the truth of this story. So thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next week on Friday for another episode of Reflections. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast, either in your podcasting platform or on YouTube, where you can see the video format of this. So thanks again for joining me. I hope I was able to offer you a new view on healing from trauma. See you next time.